There is an intelligence inside you right now that has been trying to get your attention for weeks, and you have been calling it anxiety. That's the thing nobody tells you, the signal that something is shifting, that something is reorganizing itself underneath the surface of your ordinary days. Doesn't arrive as inspiration. It doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as restlessness, as the low hum of something unfinished, as the slightly hollow feeling you get after a conversation that should have felt good, but didn't. You've been walking around with that feeling, haven't you? Telling yourself it's stress, telling yourself it's tiredness, telling yourself it'll pass once things settle down. But things don't settle, and the hum doesn't stop, because it isn't a symptom, it's a message, and the message has been building for longer than you realize. I know this because I felt the same thing, not in some vague spiritual poster way. I mean, I felt it in my chest at 2 in the morning when I couldn't explain why I was still awake. I felt it in the middle of conversations where I was nodding and smiling and completely somewhere else. I felt it in the strange, uncomfortable clarity that would arrive without warning, usually at the worst moments, usually when I was the busiest, when something inside me would go very quiet and very still, and I would have this flash of knowing that the life I was moving through at full speed was not actually the life I was supposed to be building. That's a terrifying thing to feel, when you don't have a name for it, when nobody around you seems to be feeling it, when everything on the outside looks fine, and the inside feels like a frequency that can't find its station. What I didn't understand then, and what took me a long time to actually trust, is that the discomfort was not the problem. The discomfort was the instrument working, like pressure building in a pipe, not because the pipe is broken, but because something is trying to move through it, and the opening hasn't been cleared yet. Every tradition that has ever seriously studied human consciousness, every school that went deep enough to leave something worth inheriting, described this exact stage: the pressure before the shift, the noise before the signal, the static you feel right before something in you finally gets quiet enough to hear what has been there the whole time. The question that was keeping me up wasn't, what am I doing wrong? It was, why does nothing feel like enough? And that question, I eventually understood, was not a sign that something was missing from my life. It was a sign that something was trying to emerge from it. Those are completely different problems with completely different solutions, and most people spend years solving the wrong one. If any part of this is landing somewhere real for you right now, stay with me. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if this kind of thing matters to you, you know what to do. Something in you arrived here today because the frequency got loud enough, and I want to tell you what I found when I finally stopped running from it. Because there is an intelligence older than any name we have ever given it, older than any tradition that has tried to describe it, older than the oldest language we have ever used to reach for it. And the most important thing I can tell you about it is this: it was never somewhere else. It was never hidden behind rituals you hadn't performed, or knowledge you hadn't found, or a version of yourself you hadn't become yet. Every culture that went deep enough eventually came to the same conclusion, not as poetry, not as metaphor, but as a practical, observable fact. The same organizing principle that builds a nautilus shell from the inside out, that pulls a river toward the sea without a map, that holds an ecosystem in a balance so precise that any engineer who tried to replicate it would spend a lifetime on the math. That same intelligence is the architecture underneath your awareness, not influencing it from outside, not speaking to it from above, structuring it from within. The ancient people who first mapped this didn't discover something supernatural. They discovered something so natural it had been hiding in plain sight. They looked at the night sky and saw a pattern. They looked at the human body and saw a pattern. They looked at the way attention moves, the way intention shapes outcome, the way a focused field organizes chaos differently than a scattered one, and they saw the same pattern again. And they understood something that most of us have been trained to overlook, that you are not separate from that intelligence. You are a local expression of it. The frequency it is currently broadcasting through is you. And something in that frequency has shifted recently. Something has become coherent enough to be, for the first time, genuinely useful. Not to the world in some grand sense, to you, right now, in the specific, ordinary texture of your actual life. And that is where everything begins to change. The people who first understood this were not sitting in comfort when they figured it out. They were watching everything fall apart. I think about them sometimes, not as robed figures in some idealized past, but as actual human beings under genuine pressure, people who had built systems, cities, entire ways of organizing life, and then watched those systems crack and buckle under the weight of forces no one had predicted. And in the middle of that collapse, while everyone around them was asking who is to blame, and what do we rebuild first, a smaller group of people asked a different question entirely. They asked what actually survives, not what should survive, not what we want to survive, but what, in the observable history of human civilization, has consistently outlasted every collapse before this one. And what they found was not a technique or a tradition or a set of beliefs. What they found was a type of person, someone whose interior was organized in a way that chaos could not fully disorder, someone who, when the external structure fell away, did not fall with it, because their stability was not located in the external structure to begin with. They called this quality different things in different languages, but the concept was the same everywhere they looked. And the concept was this: alignment, not perfection, not enlightenment in the distant, unreachable sense, just a person whose inner direction and outer life were pointed at roughly the same thing. That's it. That was the thing that survived every single time. And here is what terrified me when I first really understood it. Most of us have never experienced that, not even for a full day. We have moments of it, but sustained, structural alignment, the kind where you wake up and what you do matches what you actually are, that is genuinely rare. And the people who mapped this territory spent lifetimes asking why. The answer they kept arriving at was not moral failure, it was mechanical. And that distinction changes everything about how you approach the problem. Because a moral failure requires guilt, a mechanical problem requires adjustment. And the moment you stop treating your fragmentation as evidence of something wrong with you and start treating it as information about where the system is leaking, everything shifts slightly. The pressure in your chest that you have been calling anxiety starts to feel less like alarm and more like feedback. The restlessness I described earlier, the hollow feeling after conversations that should have satisfied, the 2 in the morning stillness where something goes very quiet and very honest, those stop being symptoms of a life going wrong and start being the most useful data available to you. The ancient people who studied this were not trying to build a philosophy, they were trying to solve a practical problem. How do you stop leaking the one resource that, when retained and directed, changes the quality of everything else? And the answer they arrived at has not changed in thousands of years, because the human nervous system has not changed in thousands of years. You cannot retain what you cannot first locate, and you cannot locate it until you stop being too busy to feel where it is going. So here is where I have to tell you something that took me an embarrassingly long time to actually absorb. The discomfort you are in right now is not a delay in your progress. It is the progress, the specific, uncomfortable, slightly disorienting feeling of being between one version of yourself and the next. That is not the waiting room before something begins. That is the thing itself, happening. The nautilus shell does not experience the building of its next chamber as comfortable. The pressure that forms it is real. The constriction is real. But the result is a structure more precisely organized than anything built from the outside could produce. You are in that stage right now. Something in you knows it. That is why the frequency has been so loud lately. That is why ordinary things feel slightly too small. That is why the question you keep not quite finishing, the one that starts with, "Is this really?" keeps appearing at the edges of your quietest moments. And what happens next, what you do with that question, is the part nobody can do for you. But I can tell you exactly what I found when I finally stopped running from it. And it is not what I expected, not even close. While you were going through your normal week, something was quietly mapping you, without your permission. Not in a threatening way, not in the way that word usually lands, but in the way a river maps the land it moves through, leaving traces, finding the low points, learning where resistance lives and where it doesn't. I started noticing it in the smallest things first, not in dramatic moments, but in the in-between ones. The pause before I picked up my phone in the morning, that half-second of silence before the noise started. I noticed I was dreading it. Not the day, not the work, the noise itself. Like something in me had started registering the cost of it in a way it hadn't before. I'd sit in a coffee shop and watch other people talking and feel this strange, observer-like distance. Not disconnection exactly, but a shift in perspective, like I was watching myself participate in things rather than just participating in them. And at the same time, certain moments would land with unusual weight, a specific quality of afternoon light through a window, the sound of a conversation 2 tables away where someone was being genuinely honest, and you could hear it in their voice. Small things that had no logical reason to matter more than they did, but they did matter. They mattered in a way I couldn't explain and stopped trying to, because I started to understand that what was actually happening was not a mood shift or a phase or early burnout. What was happening was a recalibration of my sensitivity. The system was learning to register things it had been too overloaded to notice before, like eyes adjusting to a different quality of light. And what that recalibration was showing me, piece by piece, day by day, was a map of my own energy, where it went, what it was feeding, what it was building or failing to build. And the map was not comfortable to look at, because here is the thing about mapping your own energy honestly. You start seeing patterns you had genuinely convinced yourself weren't there. Not dramatic patterns, not obvious ones, the subtle kind, the way you agree to things slightly faster than your actual answer would be if you waited one more second, the way certain relationships leave you lighter and others leave you slightly diminished in a way you absorb without naming, the way you reach for stimulation, a screen, a snack, a conversation, not because you want it, but because something underneath was about to become too quiet and too honest, and you weren't ready for that yet. These are not moral failures. I want to be clear about that. They are habits of energy, learned patterns of where the life force goes before you get a chance to consciously decide. And the reason they matter, the reason the ancient schools spent so much time on exactly this, is that habitual patterns of energy expenditure are the single biggest factor in whether a person's life feels like it is building towards something or just moving through time. Not talent, not circumstances, not luck in the conventional sense. Where the energy goes, consistently, without your conscious input, that is the architecture of the life you are actually living, as opposed to the one you have been intending to live. And until you can see that architecture clearly, you are renovating the wrong room. So what changed for me when I finally let myself look at it, really look, without immediately reaching for an explanation or a fix, was not that I saw something shameful. What I saw was something structural. I saw that enormous amounts of what I would have called my energy were being consumed by processes I had never consciously chosen and had never consciously examined. Old decisions living rent-free in the present, relationships I had outgrown but hadn't acknowledged outgrowing, a version of myself I was still maintaining for an audience that had long since stopped watching, and every single one of those things was drawing on the same resource, the same finite, real, consequential resource that I also needed for everything I said I wanted to build. That is the moment the question stopped being philosophical. It stopped being interesting in an abstract way and became urgent in a personal one, because the math was simple and brutal. If this much is going out without my awareness, and only this much is going toward what I actually care about, then the gap between where I am and where I want to be is not a talent problem. It is not a discipline problem. It is a leak. And you do not solve a leak by working harder. You solve it by finding where the water is going. And what I found next was something I had not expected to find. Something that made the leak not just visible, but suddenly, finally, fixable. The moment I found the leak, I realized I had been the one keeping it open. That sentence took me a long time to be able to say without flinching, because it would have been so much easier if the leak had been caused by something external, a difficult relationship, a demanding job, a season of life that was simply too heavy. And some of those things were real. I'm not dismissing them. But the leak itself, the structural one, the one underneath all the surface explanations, that one was mine. And what I mean by that is specific. I had developed, over years without noticing, a habit of making myself available to everything. Not in the generous way that sounds like, in the unexamined way, the way where your attention is a commons that anyone can wander into, where your mental and emotional bandwidth is treated as a shared resource by people who never asked permission and you never required it. And the result was that I was always slightly behind myself, always catching up to my own life rather than actually living inside it. I'd have a thought about something that genuinely mattered to me, and before I had finished the thought, something else would land, and the original thought would dissolve, not because it wasn't important, but because I had never built any structure around protecting it. And what I discovered, when I finally looked at this clearly, was that this pattern had a kind of gravity to it. Other people, situations, habits, they had organized themselves around my availability. They expected it. Some of them depended on it. And the moment I started, even slightly, even experimentally, withdrawing that availability and redirecting it somewhere more intentional, things got uncomfortable. Not dramatically, but noticeably, like I had shifted the weight in a room where everyone had adjusted their balance around where I was standing. That discomfort was important data because it told me something the self-help version of this story usually skips. Redirecting your energy, actually doing it, and not just understanding it as a concept, changes your relationships. Not all of them end, not most of them, but all of them shift, because relationships, at the energetic level, are agreements. Mostly unconscious, mostly unspoken, but real agreements about who brings what and who expects what in return. And when one person in that agreement starts changing the terms, the system reacts. It pushes back. It creates friction. It produces the exact kind of discomfort that, if you're not prepared for it, will send you straight back to the old pattern just to make the friction stop. I had done that before, more than once. Felt the pull towards something more aligned, started moving in that direction, felt the resistance, and quietly retreated back into familiar availability because the cost of continuing felt too high in the moment. And what I understand now that I didn't understand then is that the resistance is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that the system recognized a change and is attempting to correct back to baseline. That's just how systems work. The correction is automatic. Your response to the correction is the only part that is actually yours to choose. So what does it feel like when you stop retreating? When you feel the friction and stay with the redirection anyway? It feels, at first, genuinely strange, like wearing a coat that fits, but that you are not used to. Not uncomfortable in a painful way, but unfamiliar in a way your nervous system keeps flagging as suspicious. I remember walking into a situation where I would normally have immediately given my full attention and my full energy without even registering the choice. And instead, I paused. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else noticed, just internally, just for a breath. I asked myself whether this was something I was actually choosing or something I was doing on autopilot. And that pause, that single breath of actual awareness before the response, felt enormous. It felt almost transgressive, like I was breaking a rule I had never consciously agreed to follow. And nothing bad happened. The moment passed. I responded thoughtfully rather than reflexively, and the only thing that was different was that the energy cost was lower, noticeably lower. Like the difference between lifting something with your whole body tensed against it and lifting the same thing with your posture actually aligned to the weight. Same object, completely different experience. And I started to understand that this was not a discipline I needed to force. It was a skill I needed to practice. But what came right after that first real pause was something I was not at all ready for. What came after that first pause was silence. And the silence was louder than anything I had heard in years. Not external silence. The room was the same. The sounds were the same. The world kept moving at exactly its usual speed. But internally, something had gone very still. And in that stillness, I became aware of something I can only describe as the texture of my own energy. Like I had been living in a house for years and suddenly, for the first time, actually felt the weight of every piece of furniture in it, every commitment I was carrying, every version of myself I was maintaining, every unfinished internal conversation I had been postponing by staying busy enough that it couldn't catch up to me. And all of it had weight. Real, measurable, physical weight. I could feel it in my shoulders and my jaw, and the slight permanent tension behind my eyes that I had normalized so completely I had stopped registering it as tension at all. That was the first genuinely shocking thing. Not a revelation in the cosmic sense, just the simple, brutal clarity of feeling exactly how much I had been carrying without knowing I was carrying it. And the second thing that arrived in that silence, right behind the first, was a question I had never let myself finish before. Not what do I want? That question I had asked plenty of times. The question that arrived was different. It was this: what have I been feeding that I never actually chose to feed? And I sat with that for a long time. Not because the answer was complicated, because the answer was embarrassingly, uncomfortably simple, and I needed a minute before I was ready to look directly at it. What I had been feeding, consistently and without interruption, was a story about who I had to be in order for things to be okay, not who I wanted to be, not who I was building myself toward, who I had to be, right now, in order to avoid a specific quality of discomfort that I had decided, somewhere along the way, was the most dangerous thing available to me. Disapproval, not dramatic rejection, just the low-grade, ambient discomfort of someone being slightly disappointed, slightly inconvenienced, slightly less satisfied with me than they had been before. I had built an entire internal system around preventing that, and the system was expensive. It ran constantly. It processed every interaction before I entered it. It adjusted my responses in real time. It tracked outcomes and recalibrated after every conversation. And it was doing all of this in the background, beneath my awareness, drawing on the same resource I needed for everything that actually mattered to me. That is what an open circuit looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not obviously destructive, just a quiet, constant drain on something you didn't realize was finite until you felt how much lighter you were when one part of it finally switched off. And what I felt in that silence, underneath the weight I had been carrying, was not emptiness. It was something closer to the feeling of a room after the air conditioning turns off, and you realize you had been slightly tense against the noise of it the entire time. A quality of quiet that is not absence, but presence. Something that had been there the whole time, waiting beneath the machinery. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think the way it is usually described does it a disservice. It is usually described as a breakthrough, as a moment of clarity that changes everything. But that is not what it felt like. What it felt like was small, genuinely, almost disappointingly small. I made one decision, not a life-changing declaration, not a dramatic pivot. I decided to stop doing one specific thing that I had been doing reflexively for years, something that fed the story about who I had to be, and to redirect that specific pocket of energy towards something I had been telling myself I didn't have enough bandwidth for. And nothing happened immediately. No confirmation, no sign, just the faint, unfamiliar feeling of having kept something for myself that I would previously have given away before I even knew I had it. But something about that smallness was exactly right, because every significant structural change I have ever witnessed or experienced began not with a dramatic gesture, but with one precise, almost invisible redirection that shifted the direction of flow by a single degree. And a single degree, held consistently, changes the destination entirely. What I didn't know yet was what that redirection was about to make visible. And when I saw it, it reframed everything that had come before in a way I genuinely could not have prepared for. What the redirection made visible was the thing I had built my entire identity around protecting. And seeing it clearly for the first time felt like finding a load-bearing wall you didn't know was there. Here is what I mean by that. When you start redirecting energy consciously, even in small amounts, even imperfectly, the first thing that becomes visible is not what you are moving toward. It is what was depending on you staying exactly where you were. And I don't mean people, though that becomes clear too. I mean internal structures, the beliefs you built around your limitations that were actually holding the ceiling up, the stories about why certain things were not available to you that had become so foundational you had stopped experiencing them as stories at all. You experienced them as facts, as the shape of reality, as simply the way things were. And when the energy starts moving differently, those structures begin to show themselves, not because they are collapsing, but because for the first time you are not standing so close to them that you can't see their edges. I had one of these that was bigger than the others. I had a story about what kind of person gets to live with their attention fully directed towards something that genuinely matters to them. And the story said that person is different from me in some specific, unchosen way. More gifted, more disciplined from birth, more naturally wired for that kind of focused, intentional life. And I had carried that story so long and so quietly that I had genuinely stopped noticing it was a story. It had become the water I swam in, the ambient atmosphere of my interior life. And the moment I started redirecting energy, even slightly, even for 10 minutes in a morning before the noise started, the story became audible, like a sound you only notice when it stops. And what I heard it saying, clearly for the first time, was not the truth about my limitations. It was the record of every moment I had chosen comfort over clarity, and then needed an explanation for why that was reasonable. That is a hard thing to see. I want to be honest about that, because the story was not malicious. It was not self-sabotage in the dramatic sense. It was protection, real protection, built at a time when moving towards something and failing felt more dangerous than never moving at all. And the protection worked. It kept me safe from a specific kind of disappointment for a long time. But protection that was built for one season of your life does not automatically update when the season changes. It just keeps running. It keeps doing its job. And its job, at this point, was costing me more than whatever it had originally saved me from. The ancient schools had a name for this kind of structure. Not a wound, not a trauma in the clinical sense. A knot. A place where the psyche had tied itself into a loop that was once useful and was now simply consuming bandwidth. And the work they prescribed for knots was not dramatic. It was not cathartic in the theatrical way. It was slower and more honest than that. It was sustained, clear-eyed attention, not forced, not aggressive, just the willingness to look at the loop, see it for what it was, and stop feeding it with the energy it needed to keep running. Because a loop without fuel does not fight you. It simply loses its grip, gradually, almost quietly, in the same way it formed. What surprised me about this process was not that the knot loosened. I had read enough to expect that eventually. What surprised me was what was underneath it when it did, because I think I had assumed that underneath the protection there would be something fragile, something that needed careful handling, something that confirmed, in a gentler way, the original story about why I needed the protection in the first place. That is not what was there. What was there was something that felt like it had been waiting with very little urgency and very complete patience. Not desperate, not wounded, just present, like a room in your own house you had been walking past with the door closed for so long, you had forgotten it was yours. And when I stepped inside it, what I found was not a missing piece of myself. It was a quality of self-possession I had never actually experienced before. The feeling of being genuinely, structurally at home in my own attention. Not comfortable, not easy, but mine. And that feeling, once real, changed the question entirely. Because the question was no longer, how do I become someone who lives this way? The question was something simpler and much more demanding. And that question is the thing I have to tell you next. The question that changed everything was not about what I wanted. It was about whether I trusted myself enough to actually have it. And I want to stay with that for a moment because I think it sounds simpler than it is. Trust in this context is not confidence. Confidence is something you perform, something you project, something you can maintain on the outside while the interior is doing something completely different. What I'm talking about is structural trust, the kind that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. The kind where, when you make a decision, your nervous system actually agrees with it instead of quietly hedging against it. Most people I have talked to about this, and I have talked to enough of them now to feel certain about this, most people have never experienced that. Not because they lack courage or intelligence or desire, but because they have never spent enough sustained time inside their own attention to know what it actually feels like when a decision comes from the whole of them rather than from the part that is managing everyone else's comfort. And the room I described finding underneath the knot, that quality of being genuinely at home in my own attention, that was the first time I felt what structural trust actually is, not as a concept, as a physical experience. And what it felt like precisely was this. It felt like the difference between speaking and being heard at the same time, like the internal static that had always been running slightly underneath every decision I made had, for a moment, gone completely quiet. And in that quiet, the decision that was already there became obvious. Not exciting, not inspiring, just clear. The way a path is clear when the fog lifts, not because the path changed, but because you can finally see what was already there. And the decision was not dramatic. It was not a life reinvention. It was a single, honest acknowledgement of what I actually valued most and what I had been systematically underinvesting in because the story said I wasn't quite the right person for that level of commitment. The story was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, not because I had argued myself out of it, but because my body had stopped agreeing with it. And a story that the body no longer supports cannot survive sustained attention. It just gradually loses its authority, like a voice in a room where the acoustics have changed. What came after that acknowledgement was something I genuinely did not expect. I expected relief. I expected a sense of forward momentum, the feeling of finally moving in the right direction. And those things came eventually, but what came first was something closer to grief, not the devastating kind, the quiet kind, the kind that arrives when you realize how long something has been true that you weren't ready to act on yet. I sat with the weight of all the mornings I had woken up and immediately reached outward, toward the phone, toward the obligations, toward the noise, before I had spent even 30 seconds inside my own interior. All the conversations where I had been performing listening instead of actually listening, all the moments of genuine stillness that had arrived and that I had immediately filled with something, anything, because genuine stillness felt dangerously close to the question I wasn't ready to answer. That grief was not self-punishment. I want to be clear about that. It was not a verdict on the past. It was just the accurate emotional weight of understanding, finally and completely, what had been the actual cost of staying in the old pattern. And grief, when you let it move through you without turning it into a story about what it means, grief is remarkably efficient. It does not linger the way guilt does. It passes. It leaves something behind it that is cleaner than what was there before, like the air after rain. And what it left behind in me was a quality of readiness that I had not felt in a very long time. Not urgency, not the anxious forward lean of someone trying to make up for lost time. Something steadier than that. The readiness of someone who has finally stopped arguing with the direction they need to go and is simply, quietly, beginning to move. But what I discovered about actually moving, about what it requires and what it costs, and what it keeps returning you to when you forget, that is the part I have to tell you carefully, because it is the part where most people make the turn that brings them all the way back to where they started. The turn that brings people back to where they started does not look like giving up. It looks like being reasonable. That is the part nobody warns you about, because giving up is obvious. You can feel it. You can name it. You can even choose to push through it when you recognize it for what it is. But being reasonable is invisible. Being reasonable sounds like wisdom. It sounds like maturity. It sounds like the responsible, grounded thing to do. And what it actually is, at this specific stage of the process, is the most sophisticated version of the old pattern. The knot you thought you untied quietly retying itself in a more convincing shape. I watched it happen to me twice before I caught it. The first time I had been moving in the new direction for about 3 weeks. Things were genuinely shifting. The quality of my mornings had changed. The texture of my attention had changed. I was starting to feel, for the first time in a long time, like I was actually present inside my own life, rather than managing it from a slight distance. And then something came up, a real thing. A legitimate demand on my time and energy, the kind that any reasonable person would respond to. And I responded to it. And then another thing came up, and I responded to that too. And within 10 days I looked up and realized that every single pocket of redirected energy I had been carefully building had been quietly redistributed back into the old patterns, one reasonable decision at a time. And nothing felt wrong about any individual choice. Each one was justifiable. Each one was, in isolation, the correct thing to do. But the cumulative effect was that I was exactly where I had been before, and the direction I had been moving in had simply stopped. And I told myself I would restart when things settled. And things did not settle, because things do not settle. That is not how life is structured. The space never appears on its own. The readiness never arrives fully formed. The conditions never become ideal. And the person waiting for them to become ideal is not being patient. They are being reasonable. And reasonable at this stage is the enemy. What I had to learn, and I want to be precise about how I learned it, is that moving in the new direction is not something you do when the conditions support it. It is something you do that gradually creates the conditions. That sequence matters enormously, because if you wait for support before you move, you will wait a very long time. But if you move first, even slightly, even imperfectly, the support begins to build around the movement. Not immediately, not always visibly, but structurally, the way roots grow toward water, the way a body adjusts its posture around a new center of gravity. I started treating my redirected attention the way someone treats a new physical practice, not as something I did when I felt ready for it, but as something I did at a specific time, in a specific way, regardless of how ready I felt. And what happened over the following weeks was not dramatic. There was no breakthrough moment, no sudden flood of clarity or momentum. What happened was quieter and more durable than that. The new direction started to feel familiar, not comfortable yet. Familiar is not the same as comfortable, but recognizable. Like a route you have driven enough times that you stop having to actively think about the turns. And familiar, in the nervous system, means safe. And safe means the old protective patterns stop firing quite so loudly every time you move in that direction. The resistance does not disappear, but it changes quality. It stops feeling like a wall and starts feeling like friction. And friction, unlike a wall, you can move through. And the day I understood that distinction, the day I felt it physically, in my chest and my shoulders and the way my breath moved through a decision, was the day the process stopped feeling like something I was choosing to do and started feeling like something I simply was. And that shift, from effort to identity, from choosing to being, is the thing I had read about and intellectually understood for years without ever actually experiencing it. And experiencing it changes the question one more time. Not dramatically, just completely. And the new question, the one I have been sitting with since then, is the one I am about to give you. The new question that arrived after the shift was not about what to do next. It was about what I had been doing all along without realizing I was doing it. And here is what I mean by that. When you cross the line from effort into identity, from consciously choosing the new direction to simply being someone who moves that way, something becomes visible in the rearview mirror that was completely invisible while you were still in it. You start to see, with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable, that the life you were living before was not neutral. It was not simply the default state from which growth departs. It was itself a practice, an active, consistent, daily practice of a very specific set of habits, patterns, and internal agreements, maintained with enormous precision and discipline. All of it pointed in a direction you had never consciously chosen. The scattered attention was a practice. The reflexive availability was a practice. The story about what kind of person gets to live differently was a practice. All of it required energy, repetition, and maintenance. All of it was, in the strictest sense, a skill you had developed, refined, and were executing with remarkable consistency. And the reason this matters, the reason it changed the question entirely for me is this: if the old way was a skill, then the new way is also a skill. And skills are not about talent or wiring or the kind of person you were born as. Skills are about what you practice, and what you practice, consistently and over time, is entirely within your authority to choose. That understanding did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as weight, the good kind of weight, the kind that settles into your chest and your feet and makes you feel genuinely, solidly present in a way that inspiration never quite manages. Because inspiration is weather, it comes and goes. But weight, the weight of real understanding, that stays, and it changes how you stand in every room you enter after it. I started noticing it in the smallest interactions, the way I moved through a conversation differently when I was not burning energy managing the other person's impression of me, the way a decision felt cleaner when it came from the whole of me, rather than from the part doing damage control, the way time felt different, not longer exactly, but denser, more textured, more like something I was actually inside, rather than something moving past me while I tried to keep up. These were not dramatic changes. From the outside, my life probably looked largely the same, but from the inside, the quality of being in it had shifted in a way that made the previous version feel, in retrospect, like living in a house with all the windows painted over, functional, but missing something so fundamental you stop noticing it is missing, until the day one window opens, and the quality of light that comes through it makes you understand, instantly and completely what you had been living without. And that is the thing I most want to leave you with. Not a technique, not a framework, not a list of practices, though practices matter, and I will come back to them. What I want to leave you with is this single, precise, verifiable truth that I had to live my way into before I could actually believe it. The quality of your interior life, how it feels to be you on an ordinary Tuesday, in an ordinary hour, when nothing significant is happening and the world is simply moving at its usual pace. That quality is not determined by your circumstances. It is not determined by what you have achieved or what you are working toward or what has happened to you. It is determined almost entirely by where your attention lives when you are not consciously directing it. That is it. That is the whole thing. Where does your attention go when you are not watching it? Because wherever it goes habitually, that is what your nervous system is building your experience out of. That is the raw material of your life as you actually live it, not as you plan it, or remember it, or describe it to other people, but as you move through it, breath by breath, moment by moment, in real time. And that raw material is not fixed. It is not assigned at birth. It is not determined by your history, though your history has shaped the current default. It is available to be redirected, not perfectly, not immediately, not without resistance, and not without the grief of seeing clearly what the old default was costing you, but genuinely, structurally available, starting not with a grand gesture, but with the next moment you catch your attention somewhere it was not consciously sent. That moment, that single, ordinary moment of noticing, is where every real change I have ever witnessed or experienced actually began. And the moral of everything I have told you, everything I have walked you through from the restlessness at the beginning to this moment right here, is simpler than it has any right to be. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not the wrong kind of person for the life you actually want. You are someone whose attention has been running on an old program, and the program is not you. It was written before you were old enough to question it, maintained because it worked well enough to keep you functional, and it is now costing you more than it is returning. And the only thing required to begin changing it is the willingness to notice it, not to fix it immediately, not to understand it completely, just to see it clearly, honestly, without drama. Because what you can see, you can redirect, and what you redirect consistently becomes who you are. That is not philosophy. That is the most practical thing I know. So here is the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments, because I think your answer will tell you more than anything I could add. If your attention had a billing statement, if every place your focus went during an average day was listed out with the time and energy it consumed, would the largest charges be going toward the life you are trying to build or toward maintaining the one you are trying to leave? Think about that honestly, and then tell me below what you found, because your answer is the beginning of the only map that actually matters. If this reached something real in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a like, and make sure you are subscribed so the next part of this conversation finds you when it is ready to.